Welcome to another episode of Software Explorations, hosted by yours truly, Tech Coach Ralph, where we're engineered to win. Welcome, friends. Welcome, family. Welcome, everybody, everyone who has newly subscribed. Welcome to the show. Welcome to the channel. I am Tech Coach Ralph, where, above all else, we're engineered to win. In today's episode, we are going to be talking about API documentation. We have been talking about APIs for the past few weeks, what they are, what they're useful for, how to test them, how to automate them, how controllers play a role. And today we're going to be talking about one of the most important things to me, at least personally to me, is API documentation. And we are going to dive deep into it and figure out what it is, why it's useful, all that good stuff. But enough talking about it. Let's get into it. All right. So our topic for today, as I previously said, it is API documentation. So let's get into our agenda. So we're going to talk about a brief recap of APIs, testing APIs, and what controllers are. Then we're going to get into what is API documentation, why is API documentation important, what does it consist of, how to implement API documentation, and who the hell writes this documentation, because it could be a lot, right? So who the hell writes it? And we're going to look at some sample API documentation, as well as we're going to wrap it up, and we'll go from there, okay? So let's jump into it. The past few weeks, we spoke about APIs, testing APIs, and controllers. So APIs, application programming interface. We spoke about what they are and why they are so important and vital to the software development process. We also spoke on and had live streams on how to test APIs manually, as well as with automated test. We had live streams where we automated API testing with Python and the request library, as well as the one from last week, which we're going to continue on this week, with Java and Rest Assured library. And we're going to continue, right? And then last week we spoke about how controllers play a role in API development, why they're important, and eventually we're going to have some type of live stream where we're going to be implementing some type of controller. I already have some in mind for the application that I'm building, so maybe I'll do that portion on a live stream and implement a controller. I'm new to controllers. I see them all the time, but we're going to figure it out. And then lastly, we spoke about the technology and tools used for building and testing APIs. So if you haven't seen any of those videos, you need to go back and check those out because they are super important, super valuable, especially to your journey and to your guide in the tech space. All right. So definitely check that out. All right. So now API documentation. What the hell is API documentation? So API documentation is a comprehensive guide that provides developers and other stakeholders with the information they need to understand, integrate, and work with an API. So it's their guide, right? It's their user guide on how to use this API. It acts as a reference manual explaining how an API works, what it can do, and how to use it effectively. And that might be the most important word in this slide, how to use it effectively, all right? Now, why does this API documentation matter? So based on what it is, you can kind of see, right? But it facilitates developer onboarding. So you get a new developer starting. How do they get to know the system that they're going to be working on? That API documentation is going to be super useful because they're going to read it. They're going to see, okay, what are the endpoints? What are the type of methods? We spoke about methods before. What are the methods that I can take, post, get, put, patch, delete? What is the expected response? What is the request body that we're going to be sending? What is the authentication protocol? All that stuff the developers need to know in order to successfully work on it, as well as if they're integrating with a third-party API, they also need to know that same exact information. So that's what the API, that's why it matters, right? It's going to enhance collaboration between developers, QAs, product people, customer success people, sales engineers, solutions engineers, whoever's interacting with the API. Once you have the API, we have a common guide to follow, something we can talk about. It reduces development time and effort because it has to follow what the guidelines are. And if I give the documentation to somebody else, then I have to build accordingly. And if there needs to be change, we're going to make, we can make those changes, but it also has to be communicated and updated in the API documentation. It ensures maintainability, versioning, knowing what's what. Easily maintaining your APIs because we can't have it as the wild west out there. As fun as the movie was, we cannot have it be this wild west. It supports internal and it supports external and internal integration. Whether it's teams within the company who are integrating with your API, applications within the company integrate with the API, or external where it's third-party companies, third-party applications which are using your APIs in order to display information, post information. When I was learning Python, I used the basketball API from Rapid API, and I was able to display logos. I was able to display scores, display upcoming games because of their API documentation on Rapid API. And we'll look at something similar to that as we end the show today. Okay, so what is inside of the API documentation? So it gives you an overview of the actual API, explaining what it is. It tells you the endpoints and the resources that the API use, the methods and the HTTP verbs. So, the get, the post, the put, the patch, the delete. It gives you the request and the response structure. So how you should make your request. So if you're making a post request, a put request, a patch request, how it should look. And then the response of what you should be expecting back upon a successful request, as well as it says error handling over there, as a unsuccessful request. It gives you the details about the authentication and the authorization. So how to connect to it, and based on your authentication, what you are allowed to do. So one person can be authenticated as an admin and they can do anything. One person can be authenticated as a viewer and they can only get certain data, but they cannot post data. And then there's error handling. So that person who can only view data, they can only get, but they can't post. Now, if they try to post, they should get an according error message saying, hey, you don't have permission to do this, right? What the hell are you doing? Or if you structure your request poorly, it should say, okay, you're missing these fields. You need to get it together, okay? You need to get it together. Next up, it should have some code examples and tutorials on how to use the API. So some sample endpoint, it would have like the sample parameters, the sample request body, the sample responses, and how to actually use them. Then there's going to be rate limits and throttling in the documentation saying, all right, you're not going to abuse our system. No, you're not going to do it. You can send this many per this amount of time. And if you send more, we're going to reduce your rate to this. It should have versioning, what version of the API that we're on, and what happened from version to version, as well as what has been deprecated, which means what has been removed going version to version. So like, let's say you had this one particular endpoint in version 2, and in version 3, you deprecate it. You don't remove it yet, but you deprecate it so like people can stop using it. And then in version 4 or 5, you say, okay, now if you try to send a request with this endpoint or with this body, it's not going to work at all. Right? And then has the terms of use of the API as well as the licensing. So let's say you charge for your API, or they can only use it in certain circumstances. You'd have that in the term of use and the licensing. All right. So all this information has to be inside of the API documentation. So what are some implementation strategies for documenting APIs? So you design the documentation at the outset. At the very beginning, you have to me, the best strategy is to have the API documentation in parallel with the development work that's being used. And I'll tell myself right now, I need to catch up. I only have 3 endpoints, but I should have started the API documentation right away with my tech barbarians. But in our upcoming sprint, I am going to be implementing the API documentation so that whoever joins and uses the project, they can have that documentation and know how to interact with API, so they can be adding to development. They can actually be testing right off the bat, learning how to read through the documentation. That is another awesome, amazing opportunity for the tech barbarians, right? You should also use standard formats and tools. So a lot of times we see this new cool tool and we want to go use it, but then it's super confusing. Nobody uses it. It's not saying that we can't have it in addition, but we should stick to the standard formats and tools that are popular so that anybody can easily be able to navigate it. We should definitely include code examples and use cases. So here's an example of the endpoint. Here's an example of the method that's going to be used and of the request body that's going to be sent, as well as the response. And then what are some use cases that you'd use it in, right? Next up, so important, because I've seen so many outdated documentation. You have to update your documentation regularly. As you update the code, you should update your code, update your unit tests, update your documentation, or even better, update your documentation, update your unit tests, TDD, and then update your code. So now, when your documentation is updated and then your unit tests fail, you write the code to get it to pass, And now we're in a good spot, right? And then as always, might be almost as important as update regularly, encourage user feedback. Does it make sense? Is anything missing? Is anything lacking? How can we make it better? Those are the questions that you ask every single time. And that way, it's easier for the users to understand. It's easier for your developers to understand. It's easier for everybody to understand. All right. Now, who works on this documentation? So pretty much everyone works on it. Developers would be probably the first to start working on it. Where as they are developing, they are updating the documentation with, okay, what is the endpoints that we're implementing? What are the methods that we're implementing? What are the methods, the request body, the response body that we're expecting, all that type of stuff. What is authentication? So developers start off with that, right? Now, technical writers, a pretty interesting profession, they take that documentation that the developers write, because developers can write very technical. Now, the technical writers need to bridge it between the people who are going to be using the API and the technical documentation. So, they're kind of sanitizing it, making it nice, making it easy to understand. Now comes the product manager who takes that API documentation and they pretty much market it to the users, to the stakeholders. This is the API documentation. They read through it. They get familiar with it as well because they need to be able to answer questions about the product that they're building, right? Like, what kind of product owner can't answer questions about the product that they're building? So that's the role that they're going to play. And then we have the QA testers and the engineers who play a big role in the API documentation, because when I'm testing, I would love to have API documentation so I can check it against. Does the documentation match exactly what the hell we built? Because if not, then Houston, we have a problem. All right. So consider that, think about that. And then lastly, support and customer success team. So from the developers all the way to the farthest user is the support and the customer success team. They are using it to, if they're building out the program or the application for the client, then they're going to be using they're going to be consuming those APIs to make it work, to make it happen. They're going to be using that. Like, if customers are trying to integrate with our APIs, they're going to call into support, and support is going to help them to be able to use it and troubleshoot and get it working right. Okay. So the API documentation goes through a wide spectrum of people. All right. Very, very important. All right. So let's talk about some Swagger document examples, right? So because Swagger and Open API is probably like the most commonly used API documentation tools. And we've seen this website before, HTTP bin. We're going to look at that, and we're going to take a look at what it is. HTTP bin is a simple application used to HTTP request and response service. It's built on top of a repo called Flasker, and we'll talk about that as we get into it. We're going to look at the page source of HTTP bin, and then we're going to look at Flasker on the GitHub repository, right? So let's go ahead and let's do that now. All right, so this is HTTP bin. You guys have seen it before, and I've used it on live stream, but I've used it to test out APIs, stuff like that. So, like I said, a simple HTTP request and response service. You can run it locally via Docker. You guys know how much I love Docker, and pretty much this is a Swagger doc, and it's giving you all the methods that are available and what the method is. So these are the gets for the authentication methods. And these are the endpoints. So you'd pass in like basic auth, and then you'd pass in the username and the password. And if you click on it, it's going to expand. You can try it out as well. So if and Swagger allows you to try it out. A successful response is going to give you a 200. A unsuccessful is going to give you a 401. Right? User not authorized 401. So if you click on try it out, and let's say we put in tech coach Ralph, and we put password engineered to win, and we click execute. So now, in this case, it's going to give us, so it's going to be expecting this username and this password, right? So if I put tech coach Ralph here, and we put engineered to win, and we sign in, we are going to get where did it go? A 200, right? User authenticated. Now, let's say we execute again. Well, it's already saved, so we can't. All right, let's change this then. Let's change this to 2. Or let's change this one to 2. All right, and we execute that. We say now tech coach Ralph, and we say engineered
to win this, what TO, not the number 2. Let's see here. And now we get a 401 error, right? So that's how you can use the Swagger API, right? So and then if we keep going, we can do for status codes where, let's say we do this delete, say try it out, and you say we want the code of 202, for example, and we see execute. It's going to give us it'll give us the 202 code, and if we want let's say a 400 or 405, it would give us a method not allowed. So different things to do. Like, and this is how a Swagger documentation looks. This one is specific to the HTTP bin that what's his name? Kenneth Retz built, but that's pretty much how API documentation would look using Swagger, okay? And if we look at the source, view source, you can see that Swagger is throughout all of this, right? So let's say we search for so you see Swagger UI, Swagger UI. There's a bunch of Swagger all over this, right? So this is a Swagger doc, and it's built on a repo called Flasker. And if we look at that, it's going to say Flasker is a Flask extension to extract open API specifications from all Flask views registered in your API. Flasker also comes with Swagger UI embedded so you can access localhost 5000 API docs and visualize and interact with your API resources. Flasker also provides validation of the incoming data using the same specification. It can validate if the data received as a post, put, patch against is valid against the schema defined using YAML, Python dictionaries, or Marshmallow schemas. Flasker can work with simple functions of view or method view using docstring as specifications, or using @swag_from decorator to get specifications from YAML or dictionary, and also provide Swagger view, which can use Marshmallow schemas as specification. Flasker is compatible with Flask RESTful, so you can use resources and Swag specifications together. Take a look at a RESTful example. We're not going to take a look at that, but it's pretty much giving you how it works. It runs on Docker as well, all this good stuff, okay? So let's go back to, and one more documentation I want to show you. This right here is it's draft time. So the draft just passed, and this is a API for football from Rapid API. It's premium. So like I said last time, you can definitely go over to Rapid API, get sign up, get an API that you can play around with, so you can get more familiar with connecting to APIs, using APIs, interacting with them, testing them, things like that. But if we go to, let's say we navigate through, I'm kind of blocking it, but on this menu over here, I'm going to click on Teams. And then let's say we go to Team Statistics. It's going to give you the method and the endpoint, how often it's updated. And then you can, this is all the details, right? And then it'll show you in here a code. So this code snippet is a node, but you can switch to different type of code snippets. Let's say we go to Python, for instance, and we go to the request library, and it's showing you like, okay, a get request, you get the league, the season, the teams, and then it's going to give you a response of something that looks like this. And then you can interact with that however you see fit, okay? So that's the example of documentation. Let's go back to our presentation real quick as we wrap it up. All right, so that is example of our documentation. We looked at, HTTP bin, what it is. We looked at Flasker, and we looked at the source code and the page, and then we looked at the GitHub repository for Flasker, what the HTTP bin is built on top of. All right, so let's wrap it up. Conclusion. So we discussed, what API documentation is, why it's so important, and who owns the process. Now, the question is, what can you do? Well, the number one thing, anytime you come in contact with an API, ask for the documentation. Do you have documented API? Where can I interact with it? Where can I read up about it? Where can I do all that, right?
So that's the number one thing. Ask for the documentation and let's get familiar with it. We are going to go live and we're going to implement some API documentation as well, and we'll go from there. Right. So do me a favor. If you have any questions, any thoughts, any feedback, leave it in the comments. I will be sure to respond to you and make whatever adjustments, answer any of your questions, and we'll go from there. Okay. With that being said, we are going to go back to full screen. All right. There you have it. There you have it. That is our presentation on API documentation for this week. Thank you so much for tuning in. Hopefully you found that informative. Hopefully you found that helpful, and hopefully you found that entertaining, right? Because a lot of people can think that tech is super boring, but I think it's really fun, and it's how you approach it. And that's why I take this approach, excitement, gamifying it, all that good stuff, so that you can see that, you don't have to be bored doing this type of stuff. I have tons and tons of fun working on this stuff. I'll get addicted to it. So that's why I bring to you the content the way that I do. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Hopefully you found it helpful. If you did, do me a big favor. Like the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell so you know every single time that we go live, and leave me a comment leave me a comment. I'll be sure to get back to you. And if you need one-on-one coaching or additional help, go to www.techcoachralph.dev, sign up for a plan, and then we'll work together and we're going to help you level up. All right. With that being said, thank you guys so much for tuning in. I will see you guys next week for another episode of Software Explorations, Concepts and Overviews. And I will see you guys live tomorrow night, where we are going to be working on more API automation testing and documentation and all that good stuff. All right. But with that being said, this is Tech Coach Ralph with another episode of Software Explorations. We are out.
If you enjoyed the fascinating information shared in this video and you want more, be sure to hit the subscribe button to Tech Coach Ralph to be notified for new videos.